Today, we're going to cover the best practices for tar spot management. And with me, I'm Darcy Telenko at Purdue University. I also have Martin Chilvers from Michigan State University, Albert Tenuta from Ontario, and Damon Smith from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We hope to cover today a little bit about what we've learned on management of tar spot and maybe some things of thinking about as we move into the season coming up in 2024. So just for those of you that haven't experienced tar spot on your farm, I like to use these images to give an idea of what really happens when we have a severe disease outbreak. Here in Indiana, if you look at that leaf on the left where it's green, it has a lot of the tar spot stromata on that leaf. But if I find that if we're at this level in the upper canopy, it's game over and trying to slow down this disease. But the problem is when we have a favorable season, and some places we did have this year, we can go for the leaf on the left to the leaf on the right in a couple weeks. And so our goal is to try to manage this disease, get ahead of it before it starts knocking out those leaves in that upper canopy. We're going to talk a little bit about the disease cycle, just to review that is overwintering on our crop debris in our fields that have had a history of tar spot. So in Indiana, we've confirmed it in almost all of our 92 counties. In some of the areas we have higher inoculum loads and where we've seen severe disease impacts from the debris, those spores can be released in those fields with a previous history up into that lower canopy. It takes about 14 to 21 days for the stromata, so these black structures, to appear on those leaves. And after that, depending where on the season, we'll have multiple cycles that can occur and can cause some significant yield losses if we're seeing the disease develop before we're reaching that black layer in the corn. So we do know that this disease is here in the United States and is overwintering. And so it's important to understand if it's in your field and going to be a problem in season. This is the yearly distribution of tar spot since we first found it in Indiana and Illinois in 2015. And this is going to keep repeating. But you can see from every year, this disease is continuing to spread throughout the corn growing regions of the United States. We continue to add new counties each season as it continues to move across that region.
All right. So Darcy mentioned that residue really is an important piece here in terms of overwintering. We did some work with folks on this presentation, actually looking at the importance of residue in survival. And that was after the first epidemic that we had in 2018, just looking at how residue affected survival after it went through the winter. We could find survival of those spores, specifically ascospores, in that residue. So we started to take a look in subsequent experiments to actually see, how important is residue level in terms of in-season disease progress. And so this is just a diagram. This is a single site, but we've seen similar things happen at various locations. And what we're doing here at this particular location in 2021 was looking at high residue situations with two different hybrids here. So we have a resistant hybrid in the blue numbers and a red hybrid, or a susceptible hybrid in the red. And we're tracking over time from tassel growth stage through almost full maturity. And you can see, as you might expect, in the high residue situation, we get a bottom-up progress in terms of disease level. We broke the canopy out in thirds and actually rated each level. And you can see that the resistance does help in terms of overall reductions once you approach full maturity. Now let's contrast that. Next slide, Darcy. Let's contrast that with a low residue situation. And in this situation, specifically at this Arlington location, we were looking at corn following soybeans, and we had some deep tillage here. So essentially really no corn residue in this particular location. And what you can see is we still have a bottom-up spread in terms of the progress of tar spot on our hybrids. Sure, the overall severity is a bit lower than what we saw in the previous slide. But what you can start to see is that, hybrid probably is actually, really more important, hybrid choice, than trying to go in and manage this disease with some heavy duty tillage. So next slide. We can cook this down a little further and kind of look at this across various site years. And we actually have more site years than even this 7 field data set here. But we kind of broke this out and consolidated the data across these trials. And you can see in that upper left corner, the blue bars there, where we're looking at residue, high versus low situations. Sure, we get some small reduction in overall tar spot severity, but where we really get the biggest response is out of the resistant hybrids. And you can see that in the right upper right corner panel there in the green bars. And we also can look at the interaction. So the lower right quadrant there shows you the interaction of residue versus susceptibility. So where we think you really should be putting a lot of your energy is actually in choosing the right hybrid for your particular location, and maybe not be too concerned about the residue situation, especially if you're in a conservation tillage situation. I would hate to see folks abandon conservation tillage to try to manage tar spot when there's other ways we can actually do that, maybe through rotation and again, hybrid choice. So don't get too crazy about needing to go in and moldboard plow. You know, I've had farmers ask me the question, you know, how far can these spores move? We're trying to work on that with this group and understand how far those spores really can fly, but we know that they're moving a pretty good distance. So there's more to the story than just that residue there.
Yeah, thanks, Damon and Darcy. Yeah, so to sort of follow along with other agronomic factors, we took a look at a couple of elements. One of those was nitrogen rates, but then also planting density, that planting population, to see if we could drive tar spot one way or the other from those two things. And when we did these two studies, we also incorporated hybrids of different susceptibility to see how that would play into disease management as well. So here's some data from the nitrogen trials that we did. So we came through and applied urea after emergence about the V5, V6 growth stage. We did this over 2 years, 2019, 2020, and we did it at 4 locations each year. I've got a couple of locations up here where we got reasonable levels of disease develop. And so what we can see at those different nitrogen rates, so we went like a low rate of 80 pounds per acre applied, 160 pounds nitrogen applied, then 240 pounds of nitrogen applied per acre, so like above recommended levels. We couldn't drive the disease level that is shown there in those columns up or down with those various nitrogen levels. However, those different hybrids, the susceptible and more resistant variety, we did see significant differences at all of those 4 test locations that I'm showing you right here. So the takeaway from that is that the nitrogen application rate and tar spot had no relationship, but there were significant differences between the hybrids. There certainly is possible that maybe, you know, side dress timing, other micronutrients may play some small role in tar spot development, perhaps. But at this stage, we see no evidence that nitrogen rates have any real impact on tar spot severity. So the other thing that we looked at was plant populations. And what we found was kind of something somewhat counterintuitive, especially if we're familiar at all with white mold in soybeans, for example. So typically in a soybean situation, we plant, you know, narrow rows, high density, high populations of plants. We tend to favor that microclimate for those apothecia production for that white mold fungus. We found the absolute opposite here in terms of tar spots. So what we have here is the resistant on the left-hand side of the screen and the susceptible variety on the right-hand side. They show the same trends, but in that resistant hybrid, we saw a greater breakout in terms of differences. So what we observed is when we were planting 28 to 34,000 plants per acre, we actually saw a greater amount of tar spot on those plants compared to that high population of 40 to 46,000 plants per acre. However, when we look at the yield and the economically optimal planting or seeding rate, we're still down around that 30,000 plants per acre. And even though we saw some slight differences in disease scores, it didn't translate into yield impact. So bottom line, we're not making recommendations to change seeding rate at this point in time. And there's a link there to the Crop Protection Network There's a nice article there just summarizing this article, and our research paper is available too if you choose to go and look for that. So just again, nitrogen had no effect. There's high plant densities, resulted in lower tar spot, but increasing plant density is not a viable disease management strategy. But again, just like Damon said, that genetic resistance piece is critical. So selecting those hybrids that have some tolerance for tar spot is absolutely essential. Back to you, Darcy.
I think we're going to continue on with our continued research on the importance of selecting hybrids, I think is what we really need to look at in the future. So here in Indiana, we've run some hybrid by fungicide trials looking for management of tar spot. This is a combination of data ran from 2019 to 2021 when we had good disease pressure in our location. And what we did is we tried to identify some moderately resistant hybrids. I got them labeled here as moderately tolerant, and then compare them to our susceptible. And then we wanted to see if we layered in a fungicide, does those resistant lines provide enough disease reduction that does it require that fungicide application was kind of the question. And so these trials, we did use Trivapro. That was the first fungicide that had the label for tar spot. And so that's where we started. And we went at the standard VTR1 application with the standard rate at 13.7 fluid ounces. And if we look at this data, what we were finding is, yes, when we compare to the untreated, so those are the black bars, when we add resistance, we can significantly reduce tar spot without even adding a fungicide. But then with the added fungicide, what we do see is, yes, the fungicide does significantly protect against tar spot as in the untreated, but we do not see that step down disease reduction as in those moderately tolerant lines. So again, because the tolerance is there and holding tar spot at bay, it may help us provide a little bit of leeway in whether we need fungicide applied in the future. And then the biggest thing with the question is, really, what is that yield impact? And this is where some of our hybrids are running into a problem. Some of those that may have shown good tar spot resistance is that they may not be yet as high yielding as our susceptible lines. So you can kind of see here where we had one of the resistant lines that out yielded the susceptible line, whereas the other wasn't significantly different between the two. So that's kind of some of the variability that we're seeing in these hybrids, but again, pushing to try to get that resistance in, and layering an integrated management program is important. Overall, we do still see that, yes, a fungicide applied at VTR1, so if you just picked one timing, did significantly improve yield as compared to the untreated, even using Trivapro in this trials. So again, kind of layering in that we really want to look at adding hybrid resistance into our management program for tar spot. In addition, we've been just evaluating fungicides through multi-state trials here throughout the Midwest. And some of that data, and I know if you've seen this before, this is looking at that fungicide efficacy during our severe epidemic in 2021. So this is the combination of the data from Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. And where we can, all across all locations, we had over 25% tar spot in that upper canopy at R5. But you can see that most of our fungicide products will significantly reduce disease. I think some of the separation we're starting to see here is the longevity of those products in the canopy. From our work, I really think looking at tar spot fungicides can help protect that, but I also think this disease, when we have a severe epidemic, really pushes the limitations of our fungicides and how long they're really active in the canopy and how well the coverage is out there on protecting that upper canopy. If we look at the yields across the board, generally, we saw an improved yield trend. We had 3 fungicides that significantly increased yield, but on average, when we look across all of them, we got 3% or more protection, so about 7 to 18 bushels per acre across the 5 locations, with those 3 products providing 15 to 18 bushels of yield. So again, if we have tar spot pressure there, a fungicide is really going to provide some significant yield protection over not treating it. And we tried to evaluate some of this in Indiana, looking at 2 locations where we had a severe high tar spot epidemic compared to where we are in West Lafayette, where we have very low tar spot severity. And we ran these fungicide efficacy trials and timing trials, just trying to compare the high disease condition versus the low disease condition and look at that net return. And so what we found, if we look across our various fungicide products that we had evaluated, under high disease pressure, every product but one significantly increased the yield response as compared to the untreated. Where we had low disease pressure, the green bars, sometimes it was highly variable. And so on average, where we had high disease, we had about 9 bushel per acre increase in yield potential. And then under low disease pressure, we saw about a 3 bushel increase. If we look at the timing aspect of this, and all this timing is using Trivapro at the high location where we had a significant disease, we on average saw about 14.6 bushels per acre, whereas low disease, we actually saw a net loss in some of that acreage. And if we run the numbers and subtract that fungicide application cost, what we were finding is about $29 to $48 net return if we put a fungicide out versus not treating when we have high tar spot conditions. Versus when we don't have those high tar spot conditions, we may lose that fungicide application, maybe a small net return of $1.50 under that low disease pressure. So again, we're just proof of concept. When you have high disease pressure, it will pay right now to use a fungicide to protect against tar spot. Where you don't have tar spot yet, we don't need to be implementing a tar spot management program in my mind. Any questions or any thoughts for the rest of you before I move on to the other trials?
So Darcy, in terms of producers and consultants in that, in terms of assessing their risk on an annual basis when it comes to tar spot, we base that on environmental conditions, regional history, etc., right?
Correct. And I think it's important to understand what went on in your field each year. Did you have tar spot move in? Is it present? Do you have the inoculum on your farm? If you have that issue, then you really need to think about, well, how am I going to manage it in the future, especially if we move into a season where the conditions are going to be more conducive.
And we also have real-time tracking of this disease, which is unique as well, which also provides us with some early warning potential, right? As we start seeing things. We use that in Ontario quite a bit. You know, we look at U3 and what's going on there to assess our risk and what's going to happen. And we saw that in 2021 with, you know, our first year in 2020, when we saw it, we should never have had any tar spot in 2021 to any real degree. But a lot of that inoculum that came in from the US during that 2021 season really drove our disease. And so things can change really quickly.
Right. And I think it is important. So that's kind of what I just say that we will talk at this at the end again. We use the apps and the maps, and then just understanding your field history to know, what do you need to be doing for tar spot. So we got the app, the Tar Spotter app that kind of pulls those weather conditions. We're going to get more into that in another talk later. But again, we are working on developing some of these tools. So moving it forward in the fungicide side of things, we've had multiple questions come up on application timing. Should I go out with 2 applications? Especially, if we talk about when the disease starts. So if we're in a season where I see tar spot like it did in 2021 start July 4th weekend, we have a longer window of protection that we need to do to get us to harvest. And so there are multiple questions on how should we handle that? When do we need to be applying fungicide? And, what are the ways we should target it? Should we, start up front with a heavy hitter, a Veltima, Approach, Miravis, Delaro, or should we start with a generic and switch that program around? And so this has kind of led to some of the trials we've been doing the last couple of years, trying to look at that aspect. So what we have here is looking at a VTR1 application by itself, and then a VTR1 application followed by a 3-week later application using a generic. So we were using Headline Amp as our generic, and then flipping that program, starting with the generic and then following 3 weeks later with that treatment. As we look at the data, what we found in 2022, in a year where we moved from 2021 having a severe epidemic to one that we hardly had any disease. But I think this data kind of shows some importance on the timing aspect of our fungicides. So in 2022, under a low disease pressure, you can see that where we had all the single applications of VTR1, the yellow bars, they aren't significantly different from our untreated. So what that tells me is they went out too early for the epidemic to really start up, and they weren't there when the disease finally moved in. Whereas when we look at where the 3-week later application was, we do see that those applications did significantly reduce disease. Granted, our disease is still relatively low, 2% or less in our untreated. But again, this kind of demonstrates to me that, how the timing aspect may influence how well we control disease with our fungicides. Because of the low disease pressure that year, we didn't see any effect of our fungicides in increasing yield. So 2022 was a year where we could have gotten away with probably not spraying for tar spot if that was our target. So I know, we moved from 1 year where we needed to spray and protect the crop to another year where we may not. And so that's where this predicting modeling and using these apps and maps will help us try to figure that out in the future. If we look at what happened in 2023, So a year where here in Indiana, we did see a lot of disease move in, but it moved in about September when we really saw a lot of the disease take off. If we look at the average again across locations, we have a little higher level of disease. And what we're seeing again is still, it's that later application that held on the longest to keep the disease at bay. I think our first application of the VTR1 is significantly reducing disease as compared to our untreated. But you can see we really can control the disease if we add that 3-week later treatment, because again, we've expanded that window and controlled later in the season of where the disease is really ramping up across these locations. But again, we did see some significant yield bumps here. I don't have the, actually this is canopy greenness, sorry. On canopy greenness, some variability there on whether we're keeping the canopy green as compared to the non-treated control. But again, really no differences between these programs. So this year, again, I think because it came in so late, maybe we would have gotten away with just one application and reducing disease in that canopy. And then if we look at yields, I think I had a couple yields that popped. I think this headline amp Mirabis neo was the one that was more significantly more than everything else. But in general, because the disease came in so late, we didn't see significant differences between yields on this season. So again, that comes back to, was it worth the money to put that fungicide out, you know, 1 time or even 2 times this season? And we're still working on that data, so this is fresh off the analysis. And so moving forward, you know, those are some of the questions of where do we need to be? How do we need to be applying fungicides? And I thinking back to some of the works that we've done, you know, I think there's time if we see in those fields that we find tar spot often and every year to get out there and scout and find the disease and make an informed decision. But you got to be ahead of the disease. You can't be making a decision once it's way up in that upper canopy. We're not going to slow the disease down. But I think there are a lot of tools out there that can help us predict when the disease is going to be active and of concern on your farm.
So Darcy, this is a slide that one of my colleagues here in Michigan sent me. And just the importance, I think it really highlights the importance of leaving a check strip. Doesn't need to be the entire length of the field, but just something that you can use your combine to get a sense of how those applications are working or not working as you'd like for yourself. And without those, you've got no point of reference. So I just can't stress enough the importance of this. This was from that 21 epidemic, and I think there was a 50 bushel difference here in this particular field. So, you know, that's where it really paid, but it doesn't pay every year. So you've got to know your numbers to make those decisions.
And even talking about that, Marty, with some of the new technology coming out, I think it's really important to make that assessment as well. This disease, in my mind, in those fields where I have severe tar spot, it will show us how good our coverage is. And if we don't get the coverage where we want it and you think you sprayed, but the coverage wasn't there, you may have a problem in a couple of weeks. And so that's really, this is one disease that's going to show us how well we're getting fungicides out there.
Darcy, you're talking about drone applications.
Drone and other things. I can even see it in my plots where those lower leaves didn't get anything, even from my ground rig, and they're eaten alive with tar spot as well. So I do think that it is going to be important if moving ahead to make sure you have the good coverage.
We saw that a lot this year in Ontario, where any areas where there was not good coverage or so, they really showed up and popped later on. And the other side of this with the check strip information is critically important for that self-evaluation of those fields, but also having more hybrids in that selection to decrease your risk and spread it across there as well. You know, one of my cooperators here, he has 7 different hybrids. He left his check strip, and this year under our disease pressure, which was quite high and came in late based on where we are. And this is the field that's had the first field that had tar spot in 2020 and it's continued to develop quite quickly. His yield ranges responses were anywhere from 14 to 73 bushels this year over those 7. They were all positive. So again, having that check strip is critically important to evaluate your, you know, how well things are working and help you provide future decisions as well.
Yeah, but I think we have just this final summary, and we really haven't changed much the last couple of years. You know, it's really important to assess your risk. We know it's throughout a large portion of the corn production area in the United States, but is it endemic in your area? Have you really found it? Be out scouting, talk to your seed salesman about hybrid resistance. I know it takes multiple years for them to really hone in on how good the resistance is in their hybrids, but continue to ask about that. When we're thinking fungicides, we're going to recommend mixed modes of action. Again, we need to be proactive and try to protect the products that we have available. So again, mixing those components up And then understanding that timing may be very important. So the maps and apps can help you assist if you're going to have that, if you have the opportunity to vary your timing on putting a fungicide out when the fungicide should be applied. We do know that it needs to occur close to the onset of an epidemic, but I do think you still have time early on to catch some of those initial disease infections to make a decision if you want to wait that long to make that decision. But again, that's what the maps are showing. You know, in Indiana, if I get a positive, we're out scouting all season, we'll turn the county yellow. It's not telling you to go spray, it's telling you to go scout for those first signs. And we're telling you, you know, that'll at least tell you where the disease is active. And then you can turn on the app, the Tar Spotter app, and really see if has the weather conditions been conducive for the disease to really ramp up in your field. So first you need to understand, is the disease here in your area, in your fields, and then be out scouting and being informed whether we're going to need to do some treatments for tar spot. And then we also have the fungicide efficacy control tables from the Crop Protection Network that are available to give a rating on the various products that we've evaluated through this work through the last 5 years. What else do I have here? Sorry, I got some of my slide hidden. The one thing we are, you know, with Damon, some of the information that Damon presented, you know, tillage and rotation may not be as effective for tar spot, just because once these spores get going, we do see that there's movement going on. But again, just some recommendations for tar spot and trying to integrate the various aspects to try to manage this disease.
Darcy, I'd also like to just mention that folks should take a really in-depth look at the economics, right, of the farm. And yeah, we're talking about the check strips, and I think those are really, really important to look at and put pencil to paper when you're trying to figure out, especially making the decision, you know, if you don't care about apps and predicting this and you want to go the prophylactic fungicide route, you know, really put the economics on your farm, you know, at the front in the decision-making process, because what we're seeing is where we make prophylactic fungicide applications, especially in years where disease pressure is low, and we saw it in some of your slide sets there, you know, the margins are thin, right? And we're actually, the last few years, we've been at really good or strong corn prices, and that's not always going to be here. So when the corn prices start to fall, you got to really dig in and figure out what makes sense. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is to have those check strips in there and be honest with yourself in terms of what it really costs to put those products out. You know, flying fungicides on is not cheap. We know that. A lot of these products, the better products that seem to work well against tar spot, are pretty expensive. Even at your local co-op, where you probably have some contracts. So, you know, be honest with yourself, look at those hybrids and how those hybrids respond. You know, in some situations where a hybrid is maybe a little more resistant, but maybe doesn't have the yield potentials as susceptible, sometimes just the savings and the fungicide application on that resistant hybrid is enough to make that a positive economic gain. So really dig in there and make that decision.
Marty or Albert, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, this whole timing side of things is something that we struggle with because, you know, and all of us are in the Great Lakes area. So for us, getting off that tassel to silken application because of our risk for, say, gibberella ear rot, mycotoxins, we've had situations where we haven't been able to move our crop or sell our crop because of DON or other mycotoxin issues there. So that moving away from that VTR1 is one that, you know, I struggle with quite a bit. And, you know, if we look at the research in that, you know, sure, we can get some returns, we can see some benefits or some of these other applications. So, you know, I'd like to throw it out there and have this discussion right now. The research for us basically showing those early V applications are probably not, they're okay under low disease pressure years. Significant disease pressure may not be so much, so we may not see that economic benefit as much there. But how about moving towards those, you know, those R2, R3 later apps? What are your thoughts there, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, Albert, I can jump in on that one. You know, I share the same sentiment, especially on our silage corn acres here. And the other added piece I'll throw in there is product choice considerations then, and that consideration. Luckily, at least what I've seen, and I think maybe your data suggests the same, is that those products that are good for gibberella ear rot also are highly effective against tar spots. So that is a plus, and that we have good crossover in terms of efficacy. I think the key there is where folks struggle with gibberella ear rot, they need to maybe prioritize that. I hate to see us I call it tar spot tunnel vision. I hate for folks to get super heavily focused on tar spot and then forget about these even, in my mind, even more significant or wider reaching issues like mycotoxin development and vomitoxin and those sorts of things, because that could be an even bigger issue, especially on the feed outside in our silage acres. So I'm with you. I think, if we're trying to balance these two diseases and even some of the other foliar issues that we deal with here in the Great Lakes, just focusing on that tassel R1 is just a really excellent timing and trying to balance everything, right? And try to resist that temptation of just hyper focusing on tar spot, because in any given year that could move around in the window a bit, right? And you could optimize it for that disease, but we might miss some of these really other important issues if we do that.
Standability is one thing we push quite a bit of, right? Especially for the silage side of things. And your work there, Damon, you guys have done quite nicely showing those multiple contributions to our mycotoxin issues that are not just the air, right? The whole plant has to be incorporated into that. So there's so many other things that go into it. And I think our basis often is around hybrid selection, right? We concentrate highly, and growers concentrate highly on the yield side, which is critically important, and we see the benefit. But yes, definitely consider all those other factors there that can help reduce our overall disease risk, regardless if we're talking about tar spot and other diseases as well. And this brings in this whole idea of resistance management as well, right? Darcy, you mentioned the fact that a lot of the products, mixed modes of action, can help us from a tar spot perspective just because of the AIs and the different impacts on the pathogen itself and that. But also, I think another purpose for it is to delay resistance too, right? And so judicial use of these fungicides can prolong the technology and the use of these products over time as well. And we've seen that in herbicides and others. Where do we see the risk for fungicide resistance in tar spot? Do we have an idea or anything like that?
I don't think we have an idea yet, but I mean, if we look at what we're actually dealing with, and the whole fungicide risk things, is really we're dealing with 3 modes of action in field crops, right? And all of them are either medium to high risk for resistance. So if we lose one product that drops us down, one group, we will, then we're shifting again and the others are just as susceptible. So I think we have to keep that in mind. We don't spray fungicides as often in field crops. If I look at other crops where they're spraying every 7 to 10 days, the resistance there ramps up relatively fast. So I do think we need to consider that. But also we have to balance that, right? Balance what the disease is coming in, how severe is the disease, make an informed decision that yes, this fungicide application is justified, but understand that if we overuse them or use them when they're not needed or apply at low rates, we may lead ourselves down to having resistance develop. And right now, this pathogen system is one that's going to be really hard to try to determine and detect when that happens.
Well, history always repeats itself, Darcy. So I think it's inevitable that, our colleagues tell us that the pipeline in terms of fungicide development is slow, right? And so, I think that is something we definitely have to pay attention to. And I mean, we're all familiar with this. Our weed science colleagues are dealing with herbicide resistant weeds that are just a tremendous issue in terms of management. And the way we keep using fungicides, especially, if we're just going to be spraying the same product year after year after year and spray after spray after spray, it's inevitable, right? We're going to be in that situation eventually. It may take longer in the field crop side than maybe in the specialty crop side of things, but it's going to happen. And so we definitely need to keep that in mind as we make these fungicide decisions as well.
And that's where a resource like the Crop Protection Network can help too, because there's all kinds of great information there, not only on, we've talked about efficacy, et cetera, but on just management of the common diseases, corn, soybean, and wheat out there in the North America and that. So great strategies there to help us minimize this risk down the road as well.
Yes, exactly. And I just want to, as we sum up this video today, I just want to acknowledge the support that's been supporting a lot of this work that we've done throughout the region, and the Crop Protection Network for hosting us today. And again, please utilize that resource. If you have any other further questions, you can reach out to us or them as well.